Here's Todd Friel to misunderstand how science works generally and how the theory of evolution works in particular.
When an individual goes into a laboratory to test and repeat and to see and to verify a repeatable test, I say thumbs up to genuine science. Thank you for finding the cure to a disease. We love that kind of science.
Well, you know, a lot of the science that finds cures to diseases is predicated on the idea that organisms mutate and evolve, right?
And yet there's a little category switcheroo that happens. We call what happened in the past science, taking a look at what we think is data, a dinosaur bone, what happened in the geological columns. We call it science because we then interpret an old Earth presentation that somehow all this stuff just randomly came together, got all organized, wah and la, here we are.
Nobody claims that it all randomly got organized. Everything inferred to have happened in evolution happened by obeying the laws of physics and developing through the very non-random process of natural selection. Also, wah and la? I guess Todd is one of those Anglophones who doesn't understand how the word voila is spelled or pronounced.
Who says science? Problem with that is not science. Historical science isn't science at all.
Apologists will frequently try to tell you that there is a distinction between historical science and observational science. There is no such distinction. Regardless of whether you are looking into how things work now or what happened in the past, the technique is the same. You come up with a hypothesis, you make a prediction about what you should see, and you test whether you do, in fact, see what the hypothesis says you will. The fact that something happened in the past doesn't stop you from testing the evidence which that event left behind in the present.
Now, these can be smart people. They can take a look at stuff. They can even do some tests in a laboratory about how things are composed, but they can't tell us how these things happen. Why? Because they weren't eyewitnesses.
You don't have to be a direct eyewitness to an event to reasonably infer that it happened. Events in the past leave effects that can still be observed in the present. You can test for their presence and either corroborate or falsify any hypothesis you have about how that event unfolded. The idea that theories about what happened in the past are not scientific because the scientists testing these theories weren't eyewitnesses to the event in question is just wrong. If this were the case, there could be no such thing as forensic science. The whole point of forensic science is to scientifically determine what happened in the past based on clues, rather than directly witnessing the crime take place.
They can't bring it into a lab and test that process and repeat that process and observe that process. So historical science isn't really science at all.
They can't bring the event into the lab, but they can hypothesize about what happened, make predictions about what clues would be left behind if their hypothesis is correct, then look at whether those clues are in fact there. That is the essence of science. With respect to evolution, a great example of this is the fact that humans have 23 chromosome pairs, whereas chimpanzees and some other primates have 24. If, as evolution says, we have a common ancestor, one of our chromosome pairs must have become fused at some point. This gives us something we can investigate in the lab. Here's Ken Miller to explain further.
Could it have gotten lost in our lineage? If it got lost, if a whole primate chromosome was lost, that would be lethal. So there's only two possibilities. And that is, if these guys really share a common ancestor, that ancestor either had 48 chromosomes or 46. Now, if it had 48, 24 pairs, which is probably true, because 3 out of 4 have 48 chromosomes, what must have happened is that one pair of chromosomes must have gotten fused. So we should be able to look at our genome and discover that one of our chromosomes resulted from the fusion of 2 primate chromosomes. So we should be able to look around our genome. And you know what? If we don't find it, evolution is wrong. We don't share a common ancestor. So how would we find it? Well, biologists in the room will know that chromosomes have nifty little markers. They have markers called centromeres, which are DNA sequences that are used to separate them during mitosis, and they have cool little DNA sequences on the end called telomeres. What would happen if a pair of chromosomes got fused? Well, what would happen is the fusion would put telomeres where they don't belong, in the center of the chromosome, and the resulting fused chromosome should actually have 2 centromeres. One of them might become inactivated, but nonetheless it should still be there. So we can scan our genome, and you know what? If we don't find that chromosome, evolution's in trouble. Well, guess what? It's chromosome number 2. Our chromosome number 2 was formed by the fusion of 2 primate chromosomes.
This experiment was as scientific as any other experiment. It was empirical, repeatable, and falsifiable. The fact that it was testing a hypothesis about something that happened in the past makes it no less scientific.
And yet, because of that little category confusion, the world puts a lot of stock in science. And so the kids are taught right in diapers that, hey, you evolved from primordial goo. You are nothing but lucky stardust. You came from billions of years of random chance. Who says? Scientists say.
No scientists say that we came from billions of years of random chance. They say we came from billions of years of very non-random natural selection. And they say that because that's what the evidence most strongly indicates.
We tend to bow to the God science in our 21st century technological era, but it's not just the unbelievers. I fear far too many Christians are intimidated by the God science, and so they take what they are told by typically unbelieving scientists, not all of them, but by unbelieving scientists, and they try then to blend that with our holy book, which says something really different. There is clear historical narrative in Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He did it in a 24-hour day period.
Where in Genesis does it say that a day in the creation narrative is a literal 24-hour period?
It is as clear as it could possibly be, and yet the scientists say, no, we're billions and billions of years old. What are we to do? Believe God's holy book? Or maybe could we just kind of import some of that and change what it clearly states and still maintain orthodoxy?
Or maybe you could admit that what you consider orthodoxy is really pseudodoxy.
To be clear, this is not an issue of heresy. There are good believers who are going to disagree with me, a guy like Ken Ham, but I would like to make the case that when we import historical science, which isn't science at all, in a subtle sort of way, we're actually unhitching a part of the Old Testament.
It's funny that Todd derides people who bow to the God of science, but is so committed to the pretense of valuing science himself that he has to make up a distinction between science that gives him all of the technological benefits he enjoys and the science that puts his religious ideas to the test. He thinks the science that does the stuff he likes is real science, and the stuff that says his favorite book is wrong is fake science.
We call it theistic evolution, that God didn't do it in 6 24-hour days not all that long ago. No, he did it over billions and billions of years ago, and we think it's okay. We really haven't compromised much by doing that. But Kevin DeYoung would disagree. Theologian Kevin DeYoung, citing the many problems with importing historical science, which isn't science at all,
said no scientist ever,
into Genesis and calling it theistic evolution. Here's just one little problem with that position. Adam and Eve were not the first human beings. They were just Neolithic farmers among about 10 million other human beings on Earth at that time.
Well, I obviously don't believe in theistic evolution. This is actually a straw man of the position of those who do. William Lane Craig believes in theistic evolution, and he believes this.
God used a pre-existing hominin who was non-human and merely animal, not in the image of God, as the stuff, as it were, out of which then he created the first human beings.
So to believe in theistic evolution is not to believe that Adam and Eve were just two humans out of millions of others who already existed at the time.
Hey, wait a second. That's not what Genesis says.
Nor is it what theistic evolution says.
God created just those two human beings. Adam, our federal head. That's what Romans 5 says, after all. You mean there were others? Why aren't they written about in the book of Genesis? Hey, great question. How's about because Adam and Eve were the first human beings? If God evolved the place, there were a bunch of other, well, really close to being people running around, I guess Neanderthals, but Adam and Eve, they must have just evolved just a little teeny tiny bit. Maybe his back wasn't as hairy. I don't know, but suddenly, voila, he's a human being?
Now, on this point, I agree with Todd, because speciation isn't as sudden as that, and Craig sounds like he thinks it is.
That is just one problem with theistic evolution, but there are more. Number 2 from Kevin DeYoung. Adam was not specially formed by God of dust of the ground, as it says in Genesis 2, but had 2 human parents.
No, theistic evolution does not say that Adam had 2 human parents. Craig says he believes that he had 2 pre-human parents.
Hey, Two human parents? That's not what Genesis says. Exactly. Number 3 problem with theistic evolution. Eve was not directly made by God of a rib that the Lord God had taken from the man. Genesis 2:22. But she also had 2 human parents.
Well, here's what Craig says about that.
The creation of Eve out of Adam's rib is almost undeniably figurative language, rather than describing an actual surgery that took place with this rib floating in the air and then being formed into a woman. And even God's creating Adam out of dirt and then blowing into his nose, again, seems to be very, very anthropomorphic and figurative.
Now, of course, there are a lot of things that Craig thinks are not figurative that sound just as far-fetched to me, but Todd believes all the absurdities, and tut-tuts the Christians like Bill Craig for employing the bare minimum of critical thinking.
Are we starting to see that taking something that was not observed, that is not repeatable, that is not verifiable, that is a worldview that is bent on providing a mechanism to suppress the truth in unrighteousness, should not be incorporated into our holy book?
Again, theories about how humans evolved are testable. The results of those tests are empirically observable. Those results corroborate our theories about what happened, and the tests themselves are repeatable. That may not be enough to convince Todd, but he is simply incorrect to say that it isn't science.
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.